Well, today begins a magical mystery tour. We are going to look at ideas like God, eternity, the Bible, religious books, the big spiritual questions people have asked, really, for centuries. To do that, we're going to hop in our VW bus and we're going to travel around the world. And today we're going to look at the idea of God and the different concepts out there that people investigated with God over the years. We're going to begin in the Middle East. We're going to move to the Middle East, where the home of Judaism and the home of Islam. And here we come up with a couple of concepts about God. One is that God is transcendent. He is outside of us. He is different from us. That there is one God comes from this idea of the country. Also, the idea from both Islam and Judaism is that God is a person. He's not a thing. He's not a force. In Judaism, they think God is so respected that even today they don't write his name except for G-D to draw attention to his name. However, Judaism would say the purpose of life is to love God and to know God. He is a person to be loved. Islam, on the other hand, would say Allah is not someone who can come down to your level to be loved. You can know his will, you can obey his will, but you can actually not know Allah himself. Very unique perspectives on God. Now let's travel on our magical mystery tour to America. Native American Indians, those who believed in pantheism. Now we have a brand new concept about God. God is no longer a person. God is a force. He's an energy. He's in the wind. He's in the trees. He's in you and he's in me. This is a very, very different concept. God is no longer a person who's transcendent. He is a God who is in you, in me. I'm God, you're God. He's a force that we can both control and be part of. Let's travel over to Russia and we read about Russian philosophers and discover that many of the Russian thoughts that God doesn't exist. This whole idea that there's no evidence for him, that there was a time when ancient people needed superstition and things like this, but we're finally past all that. And clearly the problem of evil is a reason why there can't be an all-knowing, all-controlling, all-powerful God. Because there's evil in the world, therefore, he either doesn't know about it, he's not all-knowing, he can't do anything about it, he's not in control, or he doesn't care, therefore he's not good. Which brings us down to India. Now in India we have a very unique combination because here we believe that there can be thousands of gods. They can be both a person and an energy. God can be in you, he can be in me. God is a force that's in all things, therefore God is both good and evil because God is in all things. He's a force to be controlled. Then we move from India and the idea of God being an energy over to Greece. And in Greece we have a very unique perspective because here in Greece and Rome we have the idea that the gods are people, they are persons, they're not energy, but boy, they are unhelpful. Boy, they aren't inherently good. In fact, if you got a problem with anger, don't go talk to Zeus. He's got a problem with anger. You got a problem with lust, don't go talk to Apollo. He's got a problem with lust. And therefore the gods are relatable because they're persons, but they're not really helpful. They struggle with the same things we struggle with. So in this quick tour, you can see there are very, very different views of God, person, energy, good and evil, in you, not in you, distinct from you. And so throughout time, in the touring of philosophy and the touring of religion, as people begin to discover who is God, wonder about God, they've begun to look at the different ideas. And there's something about America in particular that Americans really want all the religions to teach the same thing. Did it sound like they taught the same thing a few minutes ago? There are radically different places. And in the 1960s, we're going to be doing 1960s music in this whole series. It was a time when people began to ask great questions about God, about purpose. Some of the same questions we're asking today. Civil rights, war, drugs. All these questions that were being asked in the 60s are right back in front of us today. And today as we discover the idea of God, I think there's something in all of us that longs for transcendence, to connect to something bigger than ourselves. For the Beatles, they had money, they had fame, they had popularity, they literally had everything. And yet, later in their life, they began to explore Eastern mysticism and the idea there must be something transcendent out there, bigger than just materialism. Others of it do it this way. We collect art. And one of the reasons we collect art is we don't want to be known as just heartless materialists. Sure, we're materialists, but we also appreciate the finer things. And so we connect with something transcendent through our appreciation for the arts. Others of us, it's through music. There's something about listening to a beautiful orchestra, going to a great ballet. There's something about that connection we have with music that it really transcends us into something bigger and something broader and something beautiful. We're not sure we'd say exactly who God is, but we know that when we listen to music, we make a connection to something transcendent. For others of us, are like, none of that's my bag. Ours is nature. We feel a connection to the transcendent when we are fly fishing on a river, when we are looking at the night sky and feeling like a small part of something far bigger. Some of us, it's going to the Grand Canyon and just having a gasp or seeing a beautiful sunrise or a beautiful sunset. We're not sure who it is or what it is, but we know we're made to be part of something transcendent, something bigger than ourselves. And others of us, we find that sense through meditation, through reflection, through contemplation. Maybe it's yoga, maybe it's journaling, but we're trying to get connected to that deeper sense of ourselves. So today, as we begin our mystery tour, I'm going to talk about this longing we have for transcendence, or how we say in our culture, spirituality. If spirituality is connecting to something bigger than ourselves, Christianity offers the chance to connect to someone bigger than ourselves. That's a very important distinction in religious thought. Is that transcendence you're longing for something, a feeling, an energy, or is it someone? Is it something bigger than yourself or someone within you? These are questions people have asked for centuries that we're going to explore together. It's interesting, this difference between something and someone. Eric Liddell in Chariots of Fire, he says, when I run, I love to run. He was an Olympic runner. He says, when I run, I feel his pleasure. He didn't just love running for the sake of running. He loved the idea that when he ran, he was connected to a person, the Creator who made him. I know for me, if I'm going to replace someone for something, it's going to be for the adrenaline rush, whether it's on my motorcycle or on the jet skis, or I took my son who's graduating from college and two of his buddies skiing in Colorado a few months ago. And we had a great time because instead of going down the main slopes, we were going through the forest of trees between the main slopes. And I am going as fast as I possibly can with 3 teenagers coming behind me, or 2 actually most of the time. And I'm weaving in and out, trying to duck underneath pine trees. And the thrill, the adrenaline rush. I love the something that is the need for speed, the something. And I got to get my speed just right, because if I go too slow, I'll get clobbered by 2 teenagers. If I go too fast, I'm going to get clobbered by one of the branches. And there's sometimes in my life I start living for something, the adrenaline rush, the adrenaline, the next thing. But there are other times I connect to transcendence through nature. That when I'm skiing, when I'm out in nature, something in me just says, wow, there's someone who made me. God, thank you for this creation. And I begin to experience a little bit what Eric Liddell was saying. Not just I like to run, I like to go fast, I like to make deals. But I'm being connected to something I was made by someone to do. Well, Paul shows up. Paul was an apostle, a follower of Jesus. He shows up in a place called Athens, where a group of philosophers and thinkers are having a mystery tour. They're basically talking about different concepts they have about God. He shows up in Athens, and here's what he says. He says, to those in Athens, I've noticed that you are on a spiritual journey. Men of Athens, he says, I perceive that in all things you're very religious. I can see your religious icons. I can see your conversations. You are trying to find something, some kind of spirituality. I notice it because of the things you've built. You have objects of worship. And as I look at your objects, I even noticed you had an altar set up, and it says the altar to an unknown God. So I can tell you're trying to find purpose and meaning and transcendence. And I want to declare to you that this thing that is unknown to you or mysterious to you or hard to figure out, this something that you're looking for, I want to proclaim Him. It's a someone. You think something is going to fulfill your heart. I'm telling you, there's someone who is designed to meet your needs. That you were created for someone, not just something. In fact, when I was in Turkey several years ago, I got to see one of these Greek Roman tombs or altars to an unknown God. Here in Pergamos at the time, you can see just this beautiful mountaintop built. It's got temples to Apollo there and Zeus. And right in the middle is this picture here on your right that actually has an altar to an unknown God. So there was this real sense that in case we miss somebody, let's at least set up an extra altar for that God we may not know. And Paul shows up and says, that God that you're looking for, I want you to know, you don't have to just search for him, you can find him. So I want to look for some mysteries together. I want to look at 3 mysteries about Christianity that are very, very unique and very, very distinct from other religions and other philosophies. Our first mystery is this. Believing you're right doesn't mean believing everyone else is wrong. Because the idea is, well, I reject Christianity because they have an exclusive truth claims. They believe Jesus is the only way to God, and that offends me. But just know every time you claim truth, you make an exclusive truth claim. Try and talk a Hindu out of karma. Karma is the very essence of how they see the world. Buddhism rejected karma and Hinduism because they rejected the caste system. So whether it's Buddha, whether it's the Indian religions or Hinduism, or whether it's Christianity, all of them make exclusive truth claims. And C.S. Lewis wrote a book that I want to allude to in this talk today called Mere Christianity. And C.S. Lewis was a scholar at Oxford, brilliant thinker, writer, reader. And as an atheist, he thought all religions were very close-minded and all religions were wrong. And yet what he discovered is as he began to investigate Christianity and the claims of Jesus, he actually discovered that as he became closer and closer to the Bible and the God presented by the Bible, he actually got more open-minded about religion, more open-minded about life, more open-minded about what is true and what's not. And he discovered this first mystery. C.S. Lewis said, believing you're right doesn't mean believing everyone else is all wrong. Now, C.S. Lewis did a series of lectures on the radio. And that lecture became what is now known as a book called Mere Christianity. So I want to show you a quick piece, and this is actually C.S. Lewis's voice telling you his argument for how he went from being an atheist to being more open-minded about truth. And because C.S. Lewis is so complicated, we have a fast draw artist to help you sort of follow his logic. Let's watch.
I have been asked to tell you what Christians believe, and I'm going to begin by telling you one thing that Christians do not need to believe. If you are a Christian, you do not have to believe that all the other religions are simply wrong all through. If you are an atheist, you do have to believe that the main point in all the religions of the whole world is simply one huge mistake. If you are a Christian, you are free to think that all these religions contain at least some hint of the truth. When I was an atheist, I had to try to persuade myself that most of the human race have always been wrong about the question that mattered to them most. When I became a Christian, I was able to take a more liberal view. But of course, being a Christian does mean thinking that where Christianity differs from other religions, Christianity is right and they are wrong. As in arithmetic, there is only one right answer to a sum, and all other answers are wrong. But some of the wrong answers are much nearer being right than others. The first big division of humanity is into the majority, who believe in some kind of God or gods, and the minority who do not. On this point, Christianity lines up with the majority, lines up with ancient Greeks and Romans, modern savages, Stoics, Platonists, Hindus, Mohammedans, etc., against the modern Western European materialist. People who all believe in God can be divided according to the sort of God they believe in. One of them is the idea that he is beyond good and evil. Now, we humans call one thing good and another thing bad, but according to some people, that is merely our human point of view. These people would say that the wiser you become, the less you would want to call anything good or bad, and the more clearly you would see that everything is good in one way and bad in another. We call a cancer bad, they would say, because it kills a man. But you might just as well call a successful surgeon bad because he kills a cancer. The other and opposite idea is that God is quite definitely good or righteous, a God who takes sides, who loves love and hates hatred, who wants us to behave in one way and not in another. The first of these views, the one that thinks God beyond good and evil, is called pantheism. It was held by the great Prussian philosopher Hegel and, as far as I can understand them, by the Hindus. The other view is held by Jews, Mohammedans, and Christians.
So here we have this real initial distinction. I'll dig a little bit more into that in a second. That is God a thing that is both good and evil, or is he a person who is outside of his creation and good? Now, many people say, Chad, these distinctions, they're really describing the same beast. It's sort of a classic analogy of 5 blind men who are holding on to an elephant. You've probably heard it before. And the 5 blind men holding on the elephant say, tell us what an elephant is like. And the one that's holding his trunk says, an elephant's like a snake. The other holding his ear says, no, an elephant is like a fan. Another leaning against the elephant says, no, an elephant's like a wall. Another holding a leg says, no, an elephant is like a trunk of a tree. The other with his tail says, no, an elephant is like a rope. And the analogy here is that all the different religions are basically holding on to a different piece of God. They're describing the same person in different ways. Now, there's several problems with this analogy. Number one, it assumes that the person who drew it knows exactly what God is like and is judging everybody else. So this is presumed omniscience. The second thing is that those characteristics could all go together. If I had 5 blind men who described that God was so small that he fits in his hand and squeaks, squeak, squeak. And another person said, God is so big, I climbed up on his back. He was 50 foot tall. He had very small arms, and he had giant teeth and roars. You say, well, that sounds like a T-Rex. The T-Rex and the mouse cannot be compatible. And the ideas that religions present about God, there are some overlaps, as C.S. Lewis said. But there are a lot of radically incompatible pieces that just don't fit together. And rather than trying to pretend that religions are all the same, it's an opportunity for us to say, what are the distinction, truth claims that each one of these make, and how do we look into it? So Paul comes to this group in Athens, and he says, the God of the unknown, I want to declare to him what he's like. And he starts with, where is the overlap between your ideas about Zeus, God's personal, God being a person, and the ideas that God presents himself to? And he says this. He says, your poets have said. He doesn't start by quoting the Bible or a religious book. He starts by quoting their philosophers, their literature, their music, their poets. Your poets have said. It's common in Greece to know that your poets have said that we are all offspring of his divine. He says, don't your poets say that we are all children of God? And he uses that as a bridge to say, God says he wants you to be his children as well. God is your creator, but he wants to be your father. Therefore, since we are the offspring of God, quoting from their letters, we ought not to think that the divine nature is like gold or silver or stone, something to be shaped by art or man's devising. And Paul basically says, if you're able to build your God out of rock or art, it can't be your God. That's just common sense. The thing you make can't be your maker. He said, and you're longing for the person who made you, and the same way people make things, a person made you a person, and you're designed to connect with them. And here again we notice that rather than using religious argument, he starts by quoting their poets and their philosophers. If you come to our exploring service, you will notice, like this morning, we didn't do a hymn, we didn't do a praise or worship song, we did some Beatles with a magical mystery tour. Like, well, that's weird. I've never been to a church that does that. What are we doing? We're doing exactly what Paul did. But instead of me quoting your poets, we have a band who can perform the poets. So we're doing the same thing. We try and find spiritual themes in music that we all recognize, poetry that we all have heard or like, and use it as a bridge to have spiritual conversations. In fact, this has been done all through history. It's funny as you think about our culture today, but the organ was not an instrument that was ever played in the church. For years, the church was like, there's never going to be an organ in our church. The only place you hear an organ was in a bar. So for years, if you wanted to hear great organ music, you would go to the bar. And in the bar, they played organ music together. And there was one particular tune that was very, very famous. It went something like this. Dun, 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 dun. and you'd grab your brewski and you'd be around with friends, hanging out at the bar, and you'd be dun 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 dun. A guy named Martin Luther, the founder of what we now know as Protestantism, noticed that people in the culture loved organ music, and they loved that tune. So he took the organ and brought it into the church, much to the chagrin. Never are we going to have one of those kind of instruments in our church, one of those organs. Years they fought to keep it out. Now you can't get it out. And this song that was a bar song, he rewrote the lyrics, and it went something like this. A mighty fortress is our God. And that hymn that you may have sung growing up was a bar song sung by an instrument that never belonged in a church. So all through history, people have tried to, in having spiritual conversations, use the music and the culture of the day to bridge and create conversations with people. So that's our first mystery. Believing that you're right doesn't mean believing everything else and everyone else is all wrong. Our second mystery is that there's a big difference between someone who is good, as C.S. Lewis said, and something that's both good and bad. Major difference. First is the difference between someone and something. Notice what Paul says here. God, who made the world and everything in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples. Again, it's not quoting the Bible here. He's reasoning with philosophy. If there really is a God, he shouldn't be able to be boxed into a temple. Does that make sense? If there really is a God, he shouldn't be something you made. He shouldn't be made with your hands, nor should he be worshipped with men's hands as though he needed anything. Because many of the gods in the Greek-Roman world, they needed your worship or they just wouldn't be able to survive. They needed you to bring them gifts. He said, if there really is a God, he shouldn't need anything. Isn't that the very essence of the idea of God? He should be the one that gives to all life, breath, and all things. Several times over the years, my teenagers would come to me, Javen or Sierra and their friends, and would say, is there any proof for God? I would say, there's actually lots of proofs for God. Similar to what C.S. Lewis is using here. Without using the Bible, common sense can give you some basic evidence to take you on your way to a belief in there's a God, and a God that's very distinct to the kind of God you hear about in the Bible. Now, I could give you the philosophical terms, the ontological argument, the teleological argument, and we'd all sort of, So let me give you some analogies that are similar. Imagine you walk into a room and there's a domino game. And you notice that one domino is knocked over. At some point in the domino stream, there's a place where the dominoes are still set up. You could come to some conclusions. The conclusion would be, somewhere about here, something entered in and started a chain reaction. Now, you know that an object at rest stays at rest and that matter and energy cannot be destroyed. We know that through science. So you know that whatever happened could not have been the dominoes starting themselves. Something outside of the domino game had to come in and start the chain reaction to bring the energy to play. This argument is the idea that when we look at the world today, we see that the world we're made in is a chain reaction of events. Things happen, children come from parents, parents come from their grandparents, etc. Something had to start the process. And it couldn't have been in the creation, it had to be outside the creation. And so we get this idea that whatever the God who made the world is, he must be outside of creation, very distinct from pantheism or the Indian religions. Second, we discover the classic question of the chicken or the egg, right? What came first, the chicken or the egg? And the idea is observable. At some point, there had to have been either an unhatched chicken or an unlaid egg. What started this? Where did the energy for the universe come from? Where did the laws of the universe come from? Where did the first chicken come from? Where did the first energy or DNA structure or the genetic code for the chicken come from? And this is what philosophers call the uncaused cause. That there had to be something outside of creation that was intelligent. It brought the DNA structure together for all the things we have. It had to be an engineer. And it had to be an uncaused cause, what Paul is saying, who doesn't need anything. Because if he needed something, then he was caused by something else that was God. Third thing I would share with my kids. I said, imagine you're walking along the beach and you come across a watch. You could look at the glass on the watch and say, oh, glass is sand, the beach is sand. Over millions and millions of years, this sand being smashed up against the water and the rocks formed what we now know as this watch. And you open it up and you see the gears that work in and out. You either go, this thing formed itself, or someone made it. If you picked up a watch and you saw the interconnected gears, the way things move, you would say, wow, This design implies a designer. And you could learn some things about the designer. You'd say the designer was smart, he was intelligent, and this thing was designed for a purpose. When you look at the world today, you look at the back of your hand, you look at the bloodstream, how it works, you look at the heart, you look at the unbelievable intricacies of your eye, the interdependent systems of your body and how it's designed. There's clear design that implies you not only have a designer, but one who's an engineer, who's smart, and who's designed you for a purpose. And lastly, C.S. Lewis argues this very well in Mere Christianity. You and I have a sense of what we should do. And the problem is, in the sense of what we should do, we also operate with the reality that we know we don't do what we should do. A flower knows what it should do. It grows and it does it. Human beings have this nature. I know I should be nice. Almost the golden rule can be found in almost every major religion. Every human being seems to be hardwired with the sense of what we should do. Where did that should come from that transcends time and transcends culture and transcends religion? It's almost like there is a being outside of religion, outside of the expressions of religion, that has put a need to do things right within all human beings. And that implies that this God is also good. So, as C.S. Lewis was investigating this, he began to unpack this idea that God is both a person who's good, Christian idea, versus he's a force that's good and bad. And here's some of the conclusions he came to in his own voice. Let's listen.
And with this big difference between pantheism and the Christian idea of God, there usually goes another. Pantheists usually believe that God, so to speak, animates the universe as you animate your body, that the universe almost is God, and anything you find in the universe is a part of God. The Christian idea is quite different. They think God invented and made the universe, like a man making a picture or composing a tune. A painter is not a picture, and he does not die if his picture is destroyed. If you do not take the distinction between good and bad very seriously, then it is easy to say that anything you find in this world is a part of God. But of course, if you think some things really bad and God really good, you must believe that God is separate from the world, and that some of the things we see in it are contrary to his will. Confronted with a cancer or a slum, the pantheist can say, if you could only see it from the divine point of view, you would realize that this also is God. The Christian replies, God made the world, that space and time, heat and cold, and all the colors and tastes, and all the animals and vegetables are things that God made up out of his head, as a man makes up a story. But it also thinks that a great many things have gone wrong with the world that God made, and that God insists on our putting them right again. That raises a very big question. If a good God made the world, why has it gone wrong? And for many years, I simply refused to listen to the Christian answers to this question, because I kept on feeling, isn't it much simpler and easier to say that the world was not made by any intelligent power? But then that threw me back into another difficulty. My argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. If the whole show was bad and senseless from A to Z, so to speak, why did I find myself in such violent reaction against it? A man feels wet when he falls into water because man is not a water animal. A fish would not feel wet. If the whole universe has no meaning, we should never have found out that it has no meaning. Just as if there were no light in the universe and therefore no creatures with eyes, we should never know it was dark. Dark would be a word without meaning.
So two things are fascinating there. Is if God is a thing, like a force who's in everything, then he's in everything. And Christianity rejects that because we don't think God is in everything. He's not in a rape. He's not in betrayal. He's not in cruelty. And this is a radical distinction between Christianity's view of God and other religions. And this idea of the problem of evil, C.S. Lewis says in a fascinating way, the problem of evil didn't actually have me reject God. It was actually the reason I knew there must have been God. Where did I get this standard that things should be acting in a certain way? That things shouldn't be operating in a cruel, mean-spirited kind of way? This drove him to God. I think of the argument this way. Darkness, we've all seen darkness, doesn't prove there's no such thing as light. Bad haircuts, we've all seen bad haircuts, that doesn't prove there's no such thing as a barber. It means that we need some more barber over there. Darkness means we need some more light over there. And cold doesn't prove there's no such thing as heat. Christianity doesn't take the idea that good and evil are equal forces, that you need good in order to know evil and you need evil to know good. We take more the scientific example of cold and heat. Cold is always the absence of heat. And so when you see cold, you can add heat, but there's a certain place in outer space that you can no longer make things colder because you've absorbed all of the heat. And God is the heat that stands on His own. And when you see places in the world that are cold with cruelty, cold with betrayal, cold with jealousy, cold with pain, that is not a proof against God. That's an area that you're saying, we need more God to show up there. And this is fundamental to the understanding of Christianity's view that God is good. Which is why Paul shows up to these folks in Athens and says, listen, for years you've been groping, you've been searching, you've been trying to find this God. I'm telling you, the God I'm presenting is the one you've always longed for, the one you've always desired. And for years God has permitted our ignorance to sort of grope and not know. But now He has made it true because God, a person, came into the world through Jesus Christ, and He was observable, He was touchable, and He gave us assurance that this is the real God by raising His Son from the dead, as we showed evidence for last week in Easter. God wanted to give you proof that He was the someone, not the something you've been looking for. Which brings us on our journey to a third mystery. This third mystery I think is worth considering as you go on this journey with us over the next 6 or 7 weeks. And that's that there's an argument that says, well, I can't believe in God or Christianity or Jesus or faith or the Bible because there's not enough evidence. There's evidence for my view. I'm a scientist, I'm a philosopher, I'm a thinker, and if you Christians could show me some evidence, then maybe I would consider it, but the burden's on you. That's a pretty substantial argument, but I want to try and propose to you that both religion and irreligion take equal amounts of faith. I would even argue that it takes more faith to be irreligious than to be religious. Let me give you an example. As the argument goes against Christianity, it says, I can't believe in Christianity or God or the Bible because there's no evidence for it. There was a guy who summarized this argument well in the 1800s. His name was William Kingan. He said it this way. It is wrong, always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe in anything on insufficient evidence. To which you might say, yeah, I believe that. That's true. And that's why I reject Christianity, because it doesn't have the evidence. Because it's wrong always, everywhere, for anyone to believe anything on insufficient evidence. Let's pause for a second. I'm going to tie my shoe while we pause and look at that. Because some of you are going to worry if I'm going to fall. Does that statement make its own criteria? Does that statement meet its own criteria? Can you empirically prove in a scientific lab what he's saying is true? No. So his whole basis of the argument is that you can't believe anything that doesn't have evidence, and there's his statement that doesn't have evidence. Problem one. Problem two, philosophers have been talking about this for years, there's not a consistent answer on what evidence is. Sure, you could, in scientific terms, you could say, article A boils at temperature B at barometric pressure C. But what evidence is there to prove something happened in history, that a piece of literature is true? So you may be asking for evidence, and you don't even have a criteria for what the evidence would look like if you could get it. We'll talk about that when we get to the Bible, and whether or not the Bible's reliable in 4 or 5 weeks. So that's worth considering. The second thing is, there's things that you and I hold dearly to as Americans, hold dearly to as human beings, that cannot be empirically proven. Remember Paul said, this is the God who gives all men life. Most of us, all of us in this room, believe strongly in civil rights, that every human being has inherent dignity. Can you prove that in the lab? There's a Russian philosopher who was sort of making fun of this idea. He says, we are all descended from apes. Therefore, love one another. And he's showing it's inconsistent to say, let's look at the patterns of evolution and Darwinism and social Darwinism, the strong eat the weak, and we came from apes. Therefore, since we observe in nature that the strong destroy the weak, and because we're here because our ancestors ate our weaker ancestors, therefore, in light of that, be kind to one another. That's inconsistent. So the evidence, if anything, would go the opposite direction, and yet there's something in us, there's a longing in all of us that every person matters. In contrast to what we see in nature, in contrast to we see how the weak are destroyed, we think you should value the weak, the poor, the handicapped, the powerless. That is a fundamental truth. Where do we get that idea? And historians tell us that idea came in, I think it was the 8th century, maybe 6th century. A group of philosophers were reflecting on the Bible's idea that everyone was made in God's image, meaning God was their creator. Not necessarily their father, but their creator. And as they reflected on this, they said, if God is all of our common creators, then every human being, regardless of background, regardless of belief, has inherent worth. Isn't that what you long for? You can't scientifically prove that. And yet people operate like that, religious or irreligious, all the time. And my point is there is evidence for the Bible, for Jesus, and for the God of the Bible. But don't fall into the idea that one has faith and one doesn't. So to do that, so Paul's conclusion to this group of philosophers in Athens is this. Guys, I want you to examine your longings and examine your objections. Don't you long for a God who made all individuals with dignity? Don't you long for not just a something, a God you can tap into, not a God who's part of good and evil? Don't something in you, even as you reject evil, you want a God who is good and is angry at evil, wants to stop hatred, wants to stop injustice? Isn't that the God you've always longed for? Isn't that God you've always wanted? He said, examine your longings. Look what he says here. I love how he says it to the philosophers. He has made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on the face of the earth, and has determined their pre-appointed times and the boundaries of their dwellings, so they would seek the Lord. God said He designed you to seek Him. He designed you to know Him. You're looking for something, and things are good, but things will not satisfy. Big things, material things, more adrenaline, more speed, more acceptance, more performance, being a good mom, being a good dad, all good things, but not what you were designed for. God designed you that you would grope for Him, that you would find Him, that you would be in friendship and relationship with Him. That's what you were designed for. As a car was designed for gasoline, the human soul was designed for God, he says. And if you look deep within yourself, you're going to find the God I'm telling you about is what you've always longed for. And He wants you to seek Him and find Him. Though He's not far from each of us, He is transcendent, but He's also immanent, which means He can be close. He can be known. You can have a friendship. You can love Him with your heart, your soul, and your mind. For in Him we live and move and have our being. And God is saying, Paul is saying, the God I'm telling you about is the God you were designed for. C.S. Lewis was an atheist for many, many years. He befriended a man named J.R. Tolkien. You probably know him as the man who wrote The Lord of the Rings. He was a strong, committed man of faith. He was a strong, committed Catholic. And as he befriended C.S. Lewis would say, I don't know why it is, but I love these fairy stories. I love these stories. I know they're fantasy, but I really connect with these stories about a good King Richard that's going to come and rescue the world from the bad king. I love these stories that someone's going to come and break the spell with a kiss. I love this idea that there's a hero that's going to come and rescue us from ourselves. And Tolkien says, that's because that's the real story of the world. There once was a world that was broken. There once was a world that was perfect, like every good story. We're currently living a story that is broken. We cannot fix it ourselves, no matter how long we try. We long for someone perfect to come into our world and to rescue us from ourselves, to break the curse of death that's upon this world, and to restore, renew, to get rid of betrayal, to restore truth, to get rid of disease and pain and the curse. And C.S. Lewis realized his deepest longings as a scholar, as an intellect, in these fantasy stories he would write and read, spoke to what he really wanted to be true about God and the world. He wanted a world that didn't have cruelty. He wanted a world where imagination and love and truth were real. And if you're a lawyer here today, or work in the law field, don't you have a hunger for justice and truth? Isn't that why you went into that? And yet you hear from the culture there's no such thing as truth, and your job is finding the truth. When you have a lawyer who's helping in a divorce case or helping with a custody battle, doesn't the truth suddenly matter? It's no longer some abstract thing. The truth matters. You want to make sure that the truth comes out, that you really were betrayed or somebody really did steal your money. You say, no, my longing is for truth. This is the God of truth. Don't you long for a God that no longer just accepts you when you're good? Every religion talks about a God who accepts you when you're good. Get your act together. But don't you have a longing? Yes. But what about when I'm not good? What about when I fall short of my own standards, let alone God's? Don't we all long for a God who would love us not on our best day, but our worst day? That's the God of the Bible. And a God who would not only stand at a distance and say, well, I'll see you in heaven, but would come to earth and demonstrate and give us proof of how He loved us by willing to not only befriend us, but even take a punishment on our behalf? Wouldn't you at least want that to be true? Wouldn't that be the kind of thing the God you've always wanted would do if He really was the kind of God you knew Him to be? Search your longings. Identify those needs, those wants in your own heart. And Paul says, you will find the God of the Bible has put those into you so you would grope and find Him. And Paul says also identify your objections. What do you mean objections? Paul finished his preaching. And in general, all the philosophers in Athens are like, this is good stuff. This is some of the best philosophy I've heard. This is some of the best religion I've heard. This is good stuff until he gets to resurrection. Because he says, and the proof's in the pudding. This isn't like just some theoretical concept. God gave assurance of this by coming to earth, by dying and raising His Son from the dead. And He's living during a time the eyewitnesses who saw Jesus alive are still alive. Go talk to them. They saw it. Some of them mocked. Others said, we'll hear you again on this matter. And I would encourage you on your journey. There might be an initial idea to mock Christianity like C.S. Lewis did. I would encourage you to take one step toward, could you tell me more? Could we go on this tour together? Could we investigate this together? I want to understand this. I remember I had a friend, his name's Peter. He was worked in the oil industry in the Shetland Islands. And he was an agnostic, and he came across C.S. Lewis's book, Mere Christianity, some of the pieces we've read about today. He said, I read that book for the first time, and I was mesmerized. I got done with this book, and I did not believe that Jesus was God. I did not believe in the God of the Bible. But for the first time in my life, holding in my hands C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity, I believe that you could be a Christian and actually have a brain. And for me, that was a major obstacle. Because I thought to be a Christian was to check your brain at the door and have a religious lobotomy. And I realized I didn't want to have a religious or any kind of lobotomy. I realized you could be smart and be a thinker, but also be a person of faith. And I want to encourage you in this series to connect with the someone you are designed to be, to find your purpose, to find His plan for you, to find that what you've been fueling your life on, whether it's accomplishment, whether it's your resume, whether it's the next big deal, those are all fine things. But those things will not satisfy if you've not learned to have a friendship and relationship with God. And I want to give you some ways that you can go on that journey. Here's a couple of books. I've referenced one of them this morning, C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. It's a new book that just came out about 6 months ago by Tim Keller called Making Sense of God. Great book in exploring your spiritual journey or your friends. The Case for Christ, C.S. Lewis, another former agnostic who began to investigate the evidence for Jesus' death and resurrection. He's got another book called The Case for a Creator. Is there even a case that there really is a God? What are the arguments for God? Because here's the one thing I think you're going to notice if you look at your own obstacles and your own longings. Everyone longs for a God who is loving. Everyone longs to be more loving in their marriage, be more loving in their community, be more loving in the world. We long for that kind of God. We know, even though we couldn't scientifically prove it, we know there's such a thing as love. It's not just chemicals. We know in our heart the world needs more love. We couldn't give you an equation for it, but we feel it, we sense it, we can articulate it. And we know that the love we want, the love we desire is not just conditional love, do right and then I'll love you. It's unconditional love the kind of love you might see on a cross, when God demonstrated His love for us in that while we were yet failures to our own standards, He died for us. Well, maybe to conclude today, how many of us don't want to be a better lover? Probably in a lot of ways, actually. But how much would want to know how to love even our enemies, those that drive us crazy? And maybe you want to move from God just being your creator to God being your father. And that's why adoption is such a key part of the Bible. God says one thing for God to be your creator, but it's a very different thing for you to invite Him to be your father to teach you how to love. So let me lead you in a quick prayer and we'll call it a day for today. Father, we need more of your love. For those here in this room who are longing for a deeper purpose, Father, would you show them how they could seek you and grope for you and find you? For those here this morning, Father, who are needing a special dose of love or comfort because of the circumstance in their life, would you be near them? For those who faced injustice, Father, would you remind them that you are equally as angry at injustice and that you too insist very strongly on putting it right. But in the meantime, Father, you are with us in the midst of our struggle. Maybe this morning you just want to say those words to God. Just say, God, I receive you as my creator, but I want you as my father. Place that kind of love inside of me this morning, that I may love others the way you love me. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. We'll see you next week as we continue the Magical Mystery Tour talking about eternity. Thanks again.